Do to others what you would have them do to you. Matthew 7:12. And I wish that this had been done for me, that I had known the history. And we had a right to know. It's our right. It should never have been withheld. And so I'm giving that back to people, paying it forward.
We appreciate you taking the time to visit with us and spread a little light on the history of the 2x2 church. I know everybody uses different words for it. I think for the ease of understanding, we're going to call it the 2x2s, which comes from how the workers go out in pairs.
Right.
Tell me a little bit about your history and growing up in it. I understand you lived on the convention grounds.
Right.
Share a little bit about that before we get into the history of the actual church.
Be glad to. My parents were Dot and Ray Berry, and they were both second generation. My grandparents haven't accepted the workers' message when my mother was 7 and my dad was a teenager. So they were pretty much raised in it. And that makes me third generation. And so I inherited my beliefs from my parents. They weren't mine. I inherited them. It would be a long time before I'd make my own set of beliefs.
That's a good way to put that you inherited your beliefs. I like that.
And whereas my grandparents had questions about God and which church and so forth, and they searched until they found it, I was born knowing the answers, but I never asked the questions. I just had all the right answers. And I knew it was right, but I didn't know why it was right. And I hadn't internalized them. I hadn't made them my own. Like you said, I call it the 2x2s also, and there's a couple of reasons for that. Wikipedia uses the term most commonly used for their pages, and that is one. And it's been used since 1925. It's not something the ex-2x2s have coined, and it's not derogatory. It's descriptive. And also the Library of Congress uses it. So, I mean, it's pretty much in place. So I refer to it as a sect sometime, a church sometime, the fellowship, just however I'm inclined. So in 1958, my family, being my mother, father, and my brother, I was 10, my brother was 6. We moved from California, where I was born, and my brother, to Mississippi. My mother was from Mississippi, and she had problems with her allergies. She wanted to move away from California, so back home, try that. And Mississippi didn't have a convention at that time. Everybody went to Alabama. Mississippi, Alabama was considered one field. And the Mississippians were wanting a convention, so some of them had been making a tent and trying to prepare for one. My folks knew this, so they, when we moved there, looked to find a place that would work to have convention. So they found 20 acres in the rural area with orchard of pecan trees. And so we moved there when school was out in June. And immediately the workers descended upon us and started converting buildings because we're going to have a convention in October. That's June to October. And friends would come and spend their vacation time and help build. There was a lot of activity going on as they converted various buildings and did whatever else. And us kids thought it was cool. They put me to painting coat hangers, and stuff. And just generally assisting around. And we were convention ground brats. I've noticed that there are a lot of convention ground brats who have left meetings too. And part of that is because we saw the workers as humans. We worked with them. We were around them constantly. And we saw that they were jealous, they got angry, they were mean sometimes, they were vengeful, and they were kind and loving. I mean, they were pure human beings, so we didn't put them on a pedestal. They didn't topple on a pedestal for me at any point, other than the recent sexual abuse that's turned up, that's toppling further. Mm-hmm. Started distancing them. I never got close to any workers, never. There's some items that were commonly in use when I grew up on conventions grounds, which I can show you. Okay, when we had convention for several years, we used chamber pots at night and outdoor outhouses during the day. We used wash basins. There were no showers. We had spit baths. We carried our Bible and hymn book in a bag, a Bible case we called it. This was a homemade one that someone made with leather and that bound it up. My dad was an upholsterer. He made several. And we used these two hymn books when I was growing up. This is 1951 and this is 1987. This is how I looked when we moved there. And this is when I left home, graduated high school. This is my family, the four of us. I was probably about 16 there. And my mother and dad, they're both passed. And then our place, this was the country home that we moved into. It had no hot water. It had no bathrooms with facilities in them. We had outhouses when we moved there. It was very primitive and a very shallow well. If you washed the car, you ran out of water. So Daddy went to work on all those issues. He's a Mr. Fix-It. And he was busy trying to get the house workable and the workers were outside. So I grew up in one of these bedrooms upstairs. One was mine and one was my brother's. The outbuildings around here, the orchards were out front. It was vastly different growing up in the country, coming from a subdivision.
I bet.
We were bored out of our minds, my brother and I. And so we escaped into books. Our highlight of the summer was the trip once a week to the library. We both can read very fast. For a time, I accepted my hand-me-down beliefs as absolute truth. For example, I was taught and believed that this church I was in was God's only right, true way. It came down in an unbroken line from the disciples when Jesus sent them out 2 by 2 on the shores of Galilee. I believe that without question. Never thought of questioning. Okay, fast forward, I graduated from high school, left home, moved to Texas, married a professing man, had 2 children, now have 4 grandchildren. I've lived in 4 states, California, Mississippi, Oklahoma, and now back in Texas for the 2nd time.
So what led up to your decision of leaving, and how did that kind of play out?
Well, when I was a teenager, I began questioning the restrictions placed on women. And I didn't think that there was a scriptural basis for them. I could not find one. And I thought that they had mistranslated or misinterpreted. So therefore, I had no qualms about trimming my hair whatsoever, and my mother didn't either. We weren't of that group that thought you should never put a scissor in your hair like some people did. And I knew that these restrictions kept people out of meetings. And some of those people were my relatives that I love very much. And so that really bothered me. And I thought if only I could find this was mistranslated or something, and the workers changed, then, my friends would go to heaven, would be together someday. And I'd often heard it said that the truth was so simple, a child could understand it. Okay, I'm turning 40. I'm not a child. I don't understand. I needed help. I wanted help. I couldn't comprehend my faith, and I had a close neighbor friend that was questioning me on it. When I told her that it was the only way and it came down from the disciples, she said, "Prove it." Duh, never thought about proving it. So until then, I resolved I was going to understand my faith, one way or the other. Last thing I did. Surely I was finally old enough. Okay? And I was armed with Jesus' promise, ask, and it shall be given to you. Seek, and you'll find, and it'll be opened up to you. I believe that. So I saw nothing wrong with asking questions. I prayed for guidance. I prayed I would not be deceived. I believed God would help me understand and would enable me to do so. And I also made a vow. I told God, if you'll help me understand, I'll help others. That's what I'm doing. The Bible encourages increasing wisdom. It says, which questioning is to increase your wisdom. It says to do so, to prove all things, to better defend our faith, to be fully persuaded, to rightly divide truth from error, to avoid being deceived, to try the spirits, to know what you believe and why. So I'd long questioned about those things that didn't have a Bible basis. I could not accept everything the workers said were required. I just couldn't. It just didn't fit. Just show me the scripture, I'll do it, I'll believe it gladly. But all these other things, I just didn't buy into. But I wasn't strong enough just to go cut off my hair and start wearing makeup to meetings. No, I wasn't going to do that. Truth is very important to me. Very, very. Truth is truth. And a belief stands or falls on its own merits. Either there is proof or there isn't proof. Either it's in the Bible or it's not. So I reasoned that since the fellowship claimed to be the one that most closely followed the New Testament teachings, there should be a scripture to back up everything. Every belief or practice, there should be a scriptural basis if they're the closest. So I set out to find those. And I began asking, seeking, knocking, asking questions. However, that didn't turn out too well. I didn't receive scriptural answers to certain questions. My questions were met with evasions, diversions, experiences, analogies, red herrings, and verbal attacks on me. Attempts to shame me, and empty appeals, this is such a little thing, you could do it for Jesus, that kind of thing. Like, for example, if I ask where does the Bible say women should not wear trousers or slacks? And I received the following replies. They weren't answers. All answers are replies, but all replies are not answers. So if you had the right spirit, you wouldn't even ask that question. The reason you can't see it is because you're unwilling. Some things we have to accept in faith. And when you question, it shows you have a wrong spirit. Now, none of these were scriptures that I asked for, And when you're looking for truthful, biblical answers, fallacious reasoning just doesn't satisfy. I didn't feel I was being leveled with, and I thought they were all cop-outs. So I was determined to figure out how I could respond to this, how I could get to the bottom of it. And so I thought, I need to understand how to argue. I'll go to the library. I look for books on the arguments. Okay, this is logic. They're under the books for debate and logic. So I picked me up some logic books, and they were a mass of confusion. There's all these diagrams with these things doing this and these circles on top of each other, Venn diagrams and all that. I'm like, oh my goodness. I thought, I need help. So I enrolled in a logic course in college. Introduction to Logic. To be able to critically think, it's necessary to be able to recognize faulty reasoning, the fallacious ones. I was the only one in the class that was there to learn critical thinking. The rest of them needed the credit. And I was older too. But so I dug in, and I thoroughly, first thing we learned was fallacious reasoning, or the fallacies. We learned to identify them. Some of them are so recognized so long that they have Latin names. They've been known that long. Like an ad hominem attack. That's an attack on the person instead of refuting the position. When they say you're not willing, or you have the wrong spirit, they're attacking me. They're not answering my question. That's called, and that method of response is got that kind of name. And it was just fascinating. I mean, everybody uses them all the time, self included. I was using them on my kids, even. But then I got to recognizing them. So the workers were using these well-known tricks of persuasion, appeals, thought stoppers, red herrings, diversions to get people to accept these traditions of theirs that were not supported by Scripture. That was shocking to me. But it was also very enlightening. And no wonder the replies didn't ring true or click. They're using counterfeit arguments. So why? Why did they do this? That's the next question. Well, I feel like I finally figured it out. They used fallacies when there was no biblical basis. When there was, they were happy to provide it. And I ran that by some ex-workers recently that have also left meeting, and both of them said, yes, that's it exactly. And they had been there and been in those shoes, and they were guilty of doing that. There's no scripture that prohibits or discourages believers from asking questions. There is this thing out there now that it's wrong to question. They're acting like you're questioning God if you question the workers. And that's not biblical at all. No scripture prohibits that. To the contrary. I mean, it's not a sin to doubt men's words. And doubt is faith in the making, actually. So when doubt's resolved, the result's deeper faith. Yeah, you've internalized it. You've made this belief your own then. So it's our right, our responsibility, everyone's, to question, even an authority over you, to make certain that you want what they want, or you're going to carry out what they want for you. And in the comments, there's 2 links for articles on questioning. They're my studies that I have put into writing that back up what I'm telling you with Scripture. So to those who are now using the ad hominem attack fallacy, saying questioning Christians are questionable Christians, I say condemnation without investigation is ignorance. That's one of my favorite sayings. So I can't encourage you enough, everyone, to study logic, learn the basis of critical thinking, and to correctly determine right, wrong, good, bad, true, false, good, evil, and to get the definition of all the key terms. That causes a lot of misunderstanding when you're talking about the word in one way and they're talking another way. And a good understanding prevents a misunderstanding. So clarify when you're questioning the key terms so that you're on the same page and you're not doing an apples to oranges thing. And another thing, as you investigate, keep a pending file in your brain. You don't have to act on everything you find right away. You stick it up there until you get more and more evidence, until there's enough to make a rational, critical thinking conclusion. I've done that for years, and a lot of times I'll be talking to my husband, or he'll tell me something, and he said, "What do you think?" Pending. And he knows it's up there. I'm still considering it. You haven't rejected it. It's stewing. Mm-hmm. That was one of the best things I did for myself, was to join that logic class, which there's a lot of online now. You wouldn't have to go to a course. And I've heard from people who've read that in my book, and they said, I'm studying it now. And so there was a seed thought there, and it's helping. It helps you in all aspects of your life to better find truth. I insisted both my children take it in university, and they said it was one of the best things they did too. They have a low tolerance for people that don't think logically too.
Yeah.
In 1988, we moved from Texas to Oklahoma City. And soon after that, I learned about a book that had been published about the church. And it was The Secret Sect by Doug Parker. I had a hard time finding it. It was published in 1982, and I didn't get it until 1990. I knew it was out there, but if you don't have a name, and you don't know the name, and you don't know the author, it was just really hard. I would shake every tree that came along, and do you know this and that? And my mother had read it at somebody's house, so I knew it existed. But the book told about a man named William Irvine who founded a new sect, they called it in the newspapers, a new sect in Ireland around 1900. And it sounded very familiar to the church I was going to and that I was raised in. It also mentioned George Walker and Jack Carroll in it, and both of those men had been in our homes. So I'm thinking, this is definitely about this church. My parents had a stash of old notes and photographs and stuff that they'd kept. And Mom would dig it out every once in a while and look through something. I knew they had it, so I asked to see it. And I thought, well, maybe some of this stuff will date before 1900, and that'll prove that this man's off base. I mean, surely there was a hymn written way back there by a worker, or a photograph, letter, notes, funeral account, workers list, convention list, anything. No, not a one. Couldn't find anything. So, thinking about the book, the author was an Australian man that I'd never heard of, and I wasn't about to trust what he wrote. I mean, me not finding anything didn't mean what he wrote was true. That's part of logic. Just because you don't know something doesn't mean it isn't true or it didn't happen, So this is critical. It's my salvation. I mean, it's eternal life. So I decided, okay, I'm going to prove or disprove this book. That's what I'll do. So first thing is you look at his sources. And his sources are in his footnotes. And he refers to countless newspaper articles and other documents that were available. So I wasn't going to go get them from him. I went on my own to the newspapers or the British Library, where they stockpile all of the newspapers and you can get copies, and obtain copies of his footnotes. Every single 38 of them. There's photographs and there's those two, and I had them certified. So this isn't just pie in the sky, somebody giving something that wasn't really or it was fake. They were certified by the newspaper and by the library. So I pored over them, and they were legit. My world turned upside down. I had to do something with this information. It's like the rug's pulled out, like finding Santa Claus isn't true or isn't real. So if it didn't start on the shores of Galilee, who, when, where, what, why, how? So I continued researching until I had proved everything in that book. I'd gotten my own copies of everything, and it was true. It was factual. I found 4 errors. They were just in the dates of an article. I mean, it didn't affect the integrity of the book at all. This led me to ponder, how could the church be God's only right way? Where does it say that in the Bible? I asked Kerry Brownlee. He started telling me about his experiences. No, I don't want experiences. I want to know where it is in the Bible. Well, I can't tell you that. I can just tell you, there wasn't any. There is no verse. No. There's the one verse that says there's one faith, one baptism, etc., etc. It's not relating to a method of worship at all. And the only verses that refer to a single way are referring to Jesus. He's the way. After a year, in 1990, my husband and I left meetings, and our children were 11 and 13. And I didn't leave quietly. I wrote a letter, a 6-page letter, typewritten, and sent it to 100 friends and family. And I got back very little response, maybe 10 or so. After that, I wrote a 52-page letter and included all sorts of the information, copies of stuff that I had acquired in the meantime with my research. After that, I just kept researching. I couldn't stop, and the scripture started opening up to me tremendously. I might mention that even though I left, I never stopped considering the Tubatus my brothers and sisters in Christ. Never. They rejected me, most of them. I kept a few friends, but I didn't reject them. I'm not going to say who the Holy Spirit works in and doesn't work in. I've seen him work outside in other Christians. I know he does. In 2004, my husband and I went to the UK researching, and also in 2014, 10 years later. On the first trip, we went to the newspaper office that I was talking about. This is the Impartial Reporter. It's located in Enniskillen, Northern Ireland. And they are the ones that published the newspaper articles that were in Doug Parker's book that I got my own certified copies of. This is one of the copies that I was sent from the British Library. I ordered them. They came in tubes like this from the library. And they certified copies of the letter of the newspaper articles to me from them. This man right here gave us a tour when we went over there.
That's cool.
This was dated 91. We went 04. He's passed now. And the man who wrote The Secret Sect, this is Doug and his wife Helen, who wrote the book, The Secret Sect. It's a black cover. In 1982, he published it. It rather rocked the Tuba world, and it was the very first history book ever on the group. Mine is the second. Originally, I was just going to include my supplemental information I got that he didn't have in his book because of when it ended. But I decided to go ahead and include everything as a standalone book, which is good because Doug has passed. His wife is not able and not willing to republish his book. So everything that's in my book was in Doug Parker's book, pretty much. His focus was on Australia because he's an Australian somewhat, and mine is America-centric. Another famous document that I did find when I was looking through my mother's and dad's things was this famous 1921. It's called Dimsdale, Staffordshire, being the county, England. And it was a workers' convention, and most of all of the UK workers who had gone abroad and the ones that were over there appeared at this convention. When my book was published, I let this same newspaper, the Impartial Reporter and Farmers Journal, know about my book and that they had published all these things, and here was a current article or book about it. And so in their newspaper here, this is what they have. This is on the front also of my website, Telling the Truth, the picture where it's readable.
Okay. So where are you in relationship with God today?
Life after meeting. Exactly. I am a hearty Christian. My husband and I both are very hearty Christians. And for a while we hopped and shopped churches. We spent some time in two churches when my children were younger, especially. One was a Christian church and the other was a Bible church, but we never joined one. Both of those teach expository style, which I very much like, and that's what we prefer. When we moved to Texas, we were pretty much housebound with my mother, who was elderly, and so we began studying together at home, and we liked it so much that we're still doing it. And we study in-depth subjects like we studied eschatology or end times. Took us a year. We went on all kind of rabbit trails and maps and you name it, and till we researched all we wanted. We followed Jesus' footsteps through the four Gospels, step by step by step. And we studied Jesus' miracles in depth, and now we're following Paul's journeys. So we're very happy doing that at home. We jokingly say we're part of the Church of the Dones, meaning been there, done that. It's not what we feel is what we need or should be doing right now, but we're not against other churches at all. The last one we visited was church locally, Chuck Swindoll's church in December. He wrote the book, The Grace Awakening. So we follow some preachers online like Gary Hamrick and Skip Heitzig, some others. Also, I'm active in Bible Study Fellowship and have been for 10 years. I started going there when I was still a tuba too, because my neighbor lady said she was really thirsty to learn more about God, and I'm like, well, duh, I've got it all. And then she says, I found a study I want us to go to, and it was this, what we call BSF, Bible Study Fellowship. And she says, I want you to go too. And so I think, well, okay, maybe I can help her, and I'll go. And well, she got accepted because you get on a waiting list, and she didn't get accepted, and I did. And so I went. I thought, I can drop out. Maybe she'll get to end any day now, any day. As we were studying Galatians, and I started understanding grace and works and legalism, and that's why we do all this stuff, and it's not for anything. It's not worth anything. Anyway, I kept going, and we moved to Oklahoma. I kept going there, and then in 2021, my cousin, Judy Temple in Mississippi, was a leader, and she got the idea of holding private special classes just for people who'd left meetings. And so I helped her recruit a class and been helping with that recruitment ever since. And starting this fall, there will be 6 classes. Half of them will be mixed with ex-tuba twos and tuba twos, and the other half are exclusively. So if anyone is interested in BSF, just contact me and I can facilitate that.
Why did you start your website?
The Telling the Truth website was started because I had researched and gathered so many documents that weren't really doing anybody any good. They were sitting in my files, and I wanted to share them. And I was at that time copying and mailing a lot of them to other people and stuff. And so if they could be online, that would be much simpler. So I had encountered such difficulty in locating a lot of this, really hard. A lot of times I would know something existed, but I couldn't get my hands on it. And without a name, it's very difficult to find information that's been published, although there have been quite a bit, but it's buried in the books, and it's not, you can't find it by knowing the title of the book, and you're not going to find anything with 2x2s written on it or whatever. So I created tellingthetruth.info. It's public, anybody can view it, and began typing copies of like the old newspapers where people could read them that way. And then I posted a photo gallery. There's over 1,000 photos of 2x2 stuff and early workers and Irvine's letters. He was a prolific letter writer, and I had volunteers that helped with all this typing. And so there's like 1,000 of his letters that are on Telling the Truth now. It's become the largest website of 2x2 documents out there. And it's just documents, it's pretty much. And I continue to update it. I get new material, and obviously I can't insert that in my book, but I can put it on the website. And if anybody wants to know what's new, there's a button on the homepage that says what's new, and you'll go straight to that.
Having your website and all the resources on that, how did that translate into writing your book? Did you just kind of take those and start writing with all the research you had done at that point?
Well, people told me that it was a maze and they didn't know where to start, and they wanted to learn more about history, but what to do, what did I recommend? And originally I had no intention to write a book. That was not it. Doug Parker had already written a book, you know. And I certainly never thought about writing a history book. I hated history. It's the only subject I ever made an F in, and that was when I was a senior and I had to pull it out fast. I was just so bored. I mean, I did not like history. And nevertheless, at some point, I don't remember when, but I realized that I could arrange facts in chronological order for somebody. And I started doing that, narrative style. And so that began with the founder. My source material, you know, a book's only as good as your sources. They've got to be credible. So there's three kinds of sources. One's primary witness, then secondary witness, and hearsay. Primary is the person was there. They're an eyewitness. And I have several accounts by eyewitness people. They're long gone, but their words live on. And then secondary is, you know, I heard it from so-and-so, or so-and-so said this, and that's not nearly as good. And some of those I acknowledge in my book. I'll say reportedly or allegedly, meaning I haven't proved it. It's not proven fact. And then there's hearsay, of course, the grapevine and rumors and whatever. So obviously there's no primary witnesses alive with firsthand knowledge of the early days. The first 200 workers on the first workers list, which was dated in 1905, they were all dead by 1960, except a few rare people like George Walker, who died at 1980 at 101. But fortunately, many of them left behind eyewitness accounts. And some of those things that I used in my book and that are on the website are newspaper articles, court documents, public records, books, ship passenger lists, letters, photographs, census, genealogy, records. Ancestry.com played a big help in that. And then also, my husband and I made these 2 visits to Ireland in 2004 and 14, researching, and collected some there.
It's 2024, so you guys got to go back again. 10 years.
Fast forward. After 30 years of researching and collecting documents and writing, I finally published my book, Preserving the Truth. There. Okay. And I wound up with 850 pages. And if you publish a book that big, the back's going to break. it's not going to hold together. So I knew I needed to get it down to around 600 pages. It was published almost 2 years ago, May 31, 2022. 50 chapters, 14 appendixes, 200 photos. And it contains countless quotations from primary and material and references to documents. Most of these are on my website. You can go right over there and read the entire document and the context yourself. And that's why on the front of the book it says, in association with telling the truth. My book is self-published. I don't have a publisher per se. It says on the book that it's by Clarion Call. That's me. That's my company. My publisher requires everybody to give themselves a name, an official name. So it's print on demand, which means each order is individually printed as it's ordered. It's not stockpiled up at the publisher's place. Amazon may order a big order and stockpile for a while and then reorder. But so what happened to Doug Parker's book was he published a certain number, and the friends and workers would go buy them up and burn them. And that won't happen to my book. It can't, because they print it as it's needed.
That's pretty cool. Mm-hmm. Okay, so obviously you have a ton of sources that you've pulled from, and you've talked about a lot of that, and some of the books behind you are a lot of those sources too.
That's right.
But tell me a little bit about where you got your materials, or what your sources were.
The main one, the most useful, is John Long's journal.
All right, so Cherie, you are our tour guide for the history of meetings of the 2x2s, the Friends and Workers. And so let's kind of hit some of the highlights on the history, starting with William Irvine, the founder.
Sure. Who was William Irvine? Well, he was the Scotsman about the reason I wrote my book. He's the founder. Unfortunately, he never wrote down the story of his life. He would have saved me a lot of trouble had he done so. So I pieced together little bits and pieces of personal information about him, which was fairly scarce, through lots of sources. He wrote over 1,000 letters, and there's very little personal details in them. But here and there, you find out he had curly hair, or he didn't wear a hat, or just little things. And he was born in a village in Scotland, Kilsyth. It's a little bit north of Glasgow, which is probably the biggest city around there, and it's a big port. And he was born on January 7, 1863. There were 9 kids in his family. He's the third child, second son. There were 3 sons and 6 daughters. His father and many of his relatives worked for a colliery, a coal mine. That was what they all did, just about. He and his brothers, everyone, uncles, cousins. And he was raised in a Presbyterian family. 4 of his sisters married in it. And we visited the church where they were. And we photographed this church while we were over there in our visit. He dropped out of school in the 4th grade. School was not mandatory back then. And he was 8 years old, and he worked at some odd jobs until he was 10. Like he was a message boy, he worked at a biscuit factory and a foundry. And at 10, he went underground. And the colliery where his dad worked, and so that was called William Baird and Company, and they were just a huge coal business in many regions, and they built homes for their people in rows attached like condos, but they would just be row after row after row and their address would be row so and so, number so and so. And so when he was 20 or 30, though, he went to night school during that time and got his education and made up that he missed. When he was 23, the sibling that he was the closest to, his sister Margaret, she was 2 years older than him. She died of tuberculosis. She was 25 years old, and it devastated him. They'd been living together. I think she was probably like a domestic. She took care of the house and everything, and he worked. And by age 30, he was a general manager at the colliery. He had a good job. The newspapers would mention this when they talked about him, because it was seemed as rather ridiculous that he gave all that up to be a penniless preacher, and from one to the other. And they tell how much he made and so forth. And in that time, it was a good money. And but he wasn't happy. And he wrote in one of his letters that he was approaching his 30th birthday, and he was thinking about taking his life. He said that. And I start my book with that, because there's such a turnaround from suicide to starting a church. Anyway, he did have an illegitimate son during that time, before he was 30, and the mother was a first cousin, and they never married. And the son was raised by Irvine's parents. He shows up in their census records. His name was Archibald. And when he was 14, he went to New Zealand to live with William Irvine's brother James, who had immigrated over there. And he became a Presbyterian minister, married, never had any kids, spent the rest of his life there. But the day after he turned 30, when he was feeling so down, Irvine, back to him now, he attended a revival service. Some of his friends wanted him to go, and it was a well-known revivalist, and his name was John McNeil. He was associated with the Moody program. And there were so many people coming that they were putting up the circus tents to hold them all. I mean, it was huge. And he went to a nearby town, and he sat there, and he surprised himself. He said, by deciding to serve the Lord no matter the cost. That was his words in his letters. Before this, he had a little interest in Scripture. I mean, he's raised Presbyterian, but I don't think it sunk in much. And he wrote at one time that his sister's death led to his spiritual turnaround, and he broke his rebellion to God. So not too long after that, he resigned his job, and he attended at the Glasgow Bible College for 2 years. And people told him he was crazy, all that. He went back home, lived with his parents while he was going to college and so forth. And they thought he was throwing away his life, but he finished the Bible school in 1895. He looked around for some group to associate with, and he settled on the Faith Mission in Scotland. He became one of their pilgrim workers, missionaries. They call themselves pilgrims and workers both. And this is all covered in chapters 1 and 2 of my book. The Faith Mission, as the name states, was a mission based on faith that sponsors missionaries. It's not a sect, not a church, not a denomination, not a religion. And they focused on rural areas in Scotland where there were no regular churches, and sometimes pastors came occasionally and so forth. And their idea was they were into converting Christians, and then they went to their own churches. They assembled with others however they chose to do so. They did have weekly prayer union meetings, they call it, where they came together. They had a newsletter that they put out every so often telling where their workers were and having spiritual articles in it and so forth. They were unsectarian, though. They weren't associated with any denomination, and they're still in existence. Their headquarters are in Edinburgh, Scotland. We visited them, and I have some pictures that I'll show. They were truly a faith mission. Their unmarried missionaries and pilgrims evangelized in pairs. They depended solely on God for their needs, like the workers do. They were given a small allowance each month, and really a pittance, and then they received donations and so forth. if they didn't make enough to cover their expenses for the building or the utilities, the headquarters would cover it for them. They print annual lists of workers, they hold annual conventions, and they use many of the same terminology as the workers do, or I should say the workers use terminology that came from them, or that there was the etymology. Some of it was just what it was in Christianity back then, some of the terms that have changed now. But they sent Faith Mission, they sent him to Ireland in 1896. And after a long dry spell, it was a really strong Catholic area where he was, and they weren't interested in anything other than Catholics. He finally got a convert, Dora Holland, and it was in 1897. She entered the work in 1902, and this is in chapter 3 of the book, all about the Faith Mission. Then along comes John Long. He encounters John Long while he's out looking for places to have missions, and he had a companion, but it's very little mention of the Faith Mission person that was with him. I think he was really the dominant one. John Long was a coal porter with the Methodists, and that means they distribute literature and provided by the Methodists. And on a bicycle, he had a bag on his bicycle. And so they came in contact with each other. And Irvine needed an opening for a mission, and John Long decided he would write back to his steward and ask if there was somewhere he could have a mission. Because at that time, they could go into different areas and preach in those churches. It was more like a meeting hall that you could use it sometimes. And he told him that there was this red-hot evangelist that he was associating with, and that he could cause a stir if they let him have a mission. And so he received permission to hold services in Neenaw Methodist Church, County Tipperary, Ireland. People have heard of this. They may not know it was at Neenaw particularly, but early workers used to talk about how 100 people were there and 40 professed, and most of them went into work. Most people of the converts became workers eventually after that, not just immediately. And John Long's steward that he reported to as the coal porter in the Methodist was named Goodhand Pattison. And Goodhand wrote a very valuable primary account to his son. It's like 15 type pages, who was in the work in South America, and he encouraged him to write down the early days. And he wrote a wonderful account of the early days that is posted on Telling the Truth. He was an elder, became a 2x2 elder, and he's the father of two brother workers, and one of them handled the hymn book, Bert Pattison, and the other one was John, and he was buried in Bolivia. The church at Neenaw is no longer standing. I was unable to visit that. It's been demolished. But John Long was the first-hand witness because he was right there at Irvine's right hand at this first mission, very first. Not saying that he preached with him, but he facilitated there. And he was also with him and kind of stuck with him, and his supervisors weren't too pleased with that he did more of that than he did distributing his literature. Then John Long wrote a first-hand journal of all of them that took place from the beginning of days till then. And it's very interesting, and shortly we'll show you a page from it and what the journals look like. I was able to go to his son's home, who still has the journals in his home, and he let me hold them and touch them and look at them, and said that I could copy them and post them on my website. This was facilitated by the man who found the journal, and he went there. John Long would not let them leave his house. So he took a scanner and he scanned these pages, and the ones that pertained up to a certain time, because John Long was excommunicated eventually and we stopped there. He went on to be an evangelist the rest of his life. It's the most comprehensive document about the early days there is, and it's just full of interesting details. So in his journal, he proclaimed the date that he believes that the 2x2 church started. Now there's conflict. People say different things. But John Long said that revival, Nina, was the origin of the Go Preacher Fellowship. And then Irvine says that he considered that where he got the seal of God in one of his letters. So that's why I use 1897 as the date. It takes a while for something to transition from a mission to a ministry and a church. And so to be really accurate, and you can say that it started at the turn of the 20th century. And that covers all that period. And it's not inaccurate. The meetings followed 5 or 6 years later. The ministry was first. And so on our 2004 trip, we visited John Long's son. His wife gave us tea, our first tea, and we were just thrilled. I was amazed to discover that it's not just one book. It's like 12 volumes of a book. This is John Long here, and then this is me holding the volumes with his son. And this is John Long and his wife. This was a picture they had on the wall. I don't know what anniversary it was commemorating. She's the sweet lady that served us tea. And this is a page from John Long's journal. It's beautiful handwriting and infinite number of pages, as you can see from all those volumes. John Long did not like his picture taken, and so there are very few pictures of him. This is one of him with his bicycle. That's how he was a colporteur. There's a book bag here. It's full of his literature.
Okay.
So it was very good memory of being there. And he was just thrilled to death that we were interested in his father's writings. And he went on to be a minister too, the son.
So just to clear up, John Long was a Methodist preacher. Colporteur. Okay. So kind of like a missionary type thing.
Or someone who just handed out literature here and there. And it was a special place in the Methodist ministry. They are known for having colporteurs.
Okay. And then eventually he became a worker.
He did.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. In fact, we'll learn a little bit later, he was the first worker to go on faith lines. But after that, there was another special mission, real special. It's called Rathmalayan. That's the name of the town. And Bill Carroll, Jack and his sister May Carroll were at the Neenah mission, and they professed there. And their brother Bill was still back in their hometown. Jack and May were working for an uncle in Neenah, and Bill was married and back in Rathmalayan. So they tell him about all this, and he gets the use of the schoolhouse for them, Irvine, to come and have a meeting in. And we visited the schoolhouse. I have a picture of that too. It was really awesome to stand in this building where they held, and it's only a 2-room building, so you knew you were in one or the other of where they had the meeting there. He held his second very successful meeting there. 3-week mission, and more than 40 people professed there, and most entered the work. Bill Carroll and his wife went on to enter the work. They were one of the married couples, and he went on to become the overseer of Australia. And Willie Gill was there. He professed, and he became the overseer of England, and Jack Carroll, overseer of Western USA. A lot of big names came out of those missions. Most of the converts were from the Church of Ireland there, and they were the up and coming. They were the cream of the crop. They really learned doctrine in those churches. I mean, they knew when those young men did. And they were like vestrymen and just all kind of, they had secretaries, offices. And so when they went with Irvine, there was a huge problem. It was a disaster to that church, and both in membership decrease and in finances, because their tithes came from the lands that those people owned. And that was not church money anymore. They couldn't count on that. So the Catholics there became concerned that he might start trying to get some of their members. And we learned from someone who lives there that the local Catholic priest told the congregation not to be concerned, that it would all fizzle out pretty soon and they'd be scarce as white mice. he was wrong. It didn't. But even today in Rathmalion, they're called the White Mice. That's the name. They're not two, but they're not anything. They're the White Mice still.
Interesting.
And when we were there, we visited a family who, the man and wife were writing a history book of the Catholic Church in that parish, and he's the one that told me this story. And they decided to include any church that got started in that parish, and that meant the 2x2. So they were researching, and he found me, and they invited us to stay with them, which we did, and it was wonderful. And they served us a dessert one time, and it was a chocolate cupcake, and on it was something white. There was a chocolate white mouse on there.
That's funny. So who are the Weirs?
Well, the Carrolls, Mrs. Carroll was a widow and had 6 kids. Jack, May, Fanny, all of them went into work except 2 married, or 1 married, and another one after she left the work. And they were friendly or related to the William Weir family in Dublin. And the Carrolls invited Irvine Weir to come and hear William Irvine preach. So he did in Rathmalion. And he was converted, and he was one of the first 3 workers that came to America, Irvine Weir, and George Walker and William Irvine in 1903. That was the very first to set foot. And his parents had the first meeting in their home. They owned a store in Dublin called Weir's of Bagot Street. And the family lived over it, and the meeting was over the shop. We visited there, went in it. They even took us upstairs. I was in the very room where they had the meeting. And the first meeting was in 1902, was there. So I have a picture of that also.
Describe the Matthew 10 study Bible.
This is what pivoted the entire church. It's monumental. Soon after, when Irvine and John Long were traveling around together, and they had a Bible study, and it was Matthew 10. And their attention was drawn to Jesus' instructions, freely ye have received, freely give, provide neither gold nor silver nor brass in your purses. So Irvine says, well, when did this stop? Would it still work? And they couldn't figure out that it stopped. So would God still provide like in total faith? And this method of going in faith without a salary and without arranged financing is called faith lines. It's one of the 3 ways that ministers are supported even today. And Faith Mission was a faith line mission with no prearranged support. So 6 months later, guess what? John Long resigned as a colporteur, and he became independently preaching on faith lines. It was in 1899. And he wasn't under Irvine. He had no supervisor, no co-worker. He wasn't associated with any church. He was totally independent. He was in close contact with Irvine, but he wasn't working directly for him or under him. We visited the Faith Mission. These are 2 different pictures about 10 or 15 years apart. And it's the headquarters, the Bible College headquarters. And we had a very lovely man there that spoke to us about it and was familiar with Irvine. I don't think the people now know him much. Then the schoolhouse at Rathmalion, that is the schoolhouse right there that we went in where he had that second fantastic mission. And then in Rathmalion, this is the Church of Ireland that was devastated, that they came out of. There's cemetery all around here. And interestingly, the Friends are buried in that cemetery also. And this is me. They gave me the key to put it in that door and open it. And then we walked in, and we were actually in the room where all of those people had mingled. Shortly, there will be a mission where Irvine takes these men to Scotland to try out faith lines and see if it worked. And they were gone in October 1899 for about 2 or 3 weeks. And they didn't starve, and they got converts, and they came back ecstatic. It works. And eventually, in 1902, there was a meeting. This is the Weirs of Bagot Street. That's me standing out in front of the building. And they had this flyer there, and it shows the full full-fledged building, and they had the meetings here. The kids lived up here and parents here and that kind of thing. And then they tell their history in the map and so forth. We picked that up in the store. In a minute, we'll talk about Willie Gill, who was one of the people in the Rathmalayan mission. The Gill family were big. Several kids, and most all of them professed, and 3 of them went into work. And this was the house where they held the first convention of workers when Irvine organized them. It's called Ash Mount. It means it's on a mountain. Willie Gill was one of the workers the one that became overseer of England. And this was his room. It's phenomenal in that it's a tiny little room and a window seat here. And there's a story about Willie. This was a big estate. They raised racehorses. They had money. And his dad was wealthy and had given him this place. And it was acreage there. And Willie felt the call to go into work. And he spent all night in agony in that room before he decided he would do it and give it up. And he sold it to his brother, and so it remained in the family. And this is a picture with Willie Gill. He was one of the older workers. There were only like 3 that were 30 when the other were 20. He was older, and Irvine was older, and this is George Walker. Irvine liked dogs, too. A lot of pictures have dogs. This is another picture that's got Willie in it with George Walker, Jack Carroll, and Edward Cooney, which we'll talk about shortly. These were some of the key figures in the beginning. So when Irvine took these young men on the bicycle trip, they didn't starve and they made converts, and so they determined that Faith Alliance really worked, and that was what God wanted them to do from now on. But suffice to say, Faith Mission was not pleased that he took these people on a trip. He didn't get their permission. And he took them to Scotland, where he was from and where they were. And he wasn't happy at Faith Mission either. He said he didn't like their Piccadilly discipline and wrote that. And so they soon parted ways in 1899. And it's sometimes said that Irvine took a bunch of Faith Missioners with him when he left. But that's not true. Faith Mission has a roster that they provided when I was there by the man who was in charge, the principal. And it's when every pilgrim began and left. And they gave me a copy. And there's no record of any Faith Missioners who left when he did. And over a span of 2 to 6 years, there were 6 Faith Missioners that left and joined Irvine. Eventually. After this, he held several missions in various counties, one in County Tipperary, where that good hen Pattison lived and where he wrote his account. And this is all covered in chapter 8.
So Edward Cooney, when did he come in contact with William, and how did that play out?
Edward Cooney was a traveler for his father's company. He had a drapery business, which is kind of like a textile fabric and that sort of thing. And so he was a traveling salesman in our language. And he had first heard about Irvine, and he wanted to meet him, and then it happened. And so he became the second most prominent worker ever in the beginning, in the early days. And he was from Enniskillen, the same place where the Impartial Reporter newspaper was, and also where the first convention was held. He's the son of a well-known, successful merchant. He's 5 brothers and 2 sisters. And unlike many of the workers, he was educated. He and his brothers went through Portora. And this was a well-known university that a lot of famous people went through that was located there in town. He was raised in the Church of Ireland, Anglican. But his father was very against him becoming a preacher and preaching with Irvine's band of workers. Cooney was always spiritually minded, and he was meeting with some of the men locally, and they would go to poor sections and preach and things. I mean, he was doing that kind of thing and had that bent. After he went into work, his father wrote him out of the will unless he returned to the church, and he didn't. He entered the work in 1901, and he donated 1,300 pounds to the poor at the time, and that was no small sum. And there's a question about where did this go? Did it go to really the poor? His biographer says it did. Or did it go to Irvine? Is that what financed them when they went to all these foreign countries? Because they started going abroad about that time. We don't know. But Cooney gave it all up. He told a story that he had one thing to do before he really literally started preaching, and that was to go to Bill Carroll's wedding. And so he'd given all his money up, and he had enough to get to a certain place, and he didn't know how he was going to go from there. And so he got there, and the train master got wind that he was a preacher or something, and he stamped his ticket, and it said it was free. And then he got somewhere, and he didn't know, where am I going to stay, what? And he wound up locating a friend's mother and then in the middle of the night, some man got up and was moved to come and give him some money. And he put it in an envelope, and he gave it to the lady of the house and said, put this by his breakfast plate. And it was enough to get to Bill Carroll's. I mean, he was living on faith, big time, and for sure. Cooney was a tremendous asset. They said, that gave it the impetus. He could pitch his voice. You could hear him all over the place. And he attracted large crowds. He was just charismatic. And the press called him the hot gospeler of his time. He was really something. And so it's not surprising that his converts called him the Cooneyites, or Cooneyism, and an eponym of his name. Cooney wrote 4 hymns in the book. It's still in the book. As we gather, Lord, we are met together. Our God, our Father, grant us grace. And here we come and seek to pray. He would be excommunicated in 1928, but his well-loved hymns live on. He has a biographer that wrote these 4 books all about Cooney, and the life and ministry of Edward Cooney was the first one. It's his autobiography. These others are writings of his. And we met her, had tea at her house too. Her name is, what is her name? Patricia Roberts, yeah. When someone's excommunicated, you usually have some followers, some loyal people. Cooney had them. And that's what Patricia Roberts is. She's from that group. Her parents went with him when they were loyal. And so another lady named Mary Rogers wrote about I made a comparison of the Cooneyites, the Irvinites, the people that followed Irvine when he was excommunicated, and the Two-by-Twos. And there's a chart, of each, the comparison of their doctrine, and one of his followers made that for me. Yeah, Cooney would figure in really big, and more about that later.
By this time, William had cut ties with the Faith Mission. What was that like then in the early days of the group, like the workers and things like that?
Well, from 1899 to 1903, there were more and more converts went out preaching on Matthew 10 faith lines. There was another man, Robert Todd, who had left Faith Mission a little earlier, and he had put together a mission. They call it Todd's Mission, and he was kind of sending preachers out and being their supervisor. And so Irvine was sending some of them, go be with Todd, go see Todd and he'll help you along. And then others were just doing their own thing out there, just preaching independently. And Irvine was sending a number of them to be with John Long for him to sort of train them. And he didn't leave anybody with him very long, John said. And he tells the names of them, and most all of them wound up on the first workers list. So they were scattered, and they didn't have any training, and some never preached before. They came right off the farm. They had no seminary. But some were schooled in their churches, like the Church of Ireland bunch from Rathmalion. Irvine was evangelizing, and behind the scenes, he started building these portable wooden halls for them to preach in, arranging them being moved and so forth. And there was a lot of street preaching, and each town would have a small town, maybe large. They have a diamond or something where somebody could get on their soapbox and speak and everybody would come listen or not. They would march through the streets singing hymns even. So they were all unsectarian, though. They were just a ministry trying to bring people to Jesus, and there were no meetings, no baptisms, no emblems. They accepted other preachers as saved, and other Christians were their brothers and sisters in Christ, and they just left where they went for worship up to the person. They were unsectarian.
Okay, so when did that change? When did it become what we know as the Friends and Workers?
Well, that began back in Rathmalion. Willie Gill had a large place, and so Irvine gathered them there together, all the ones that were out preaching. There were about 70 of them at the time, men and women, and they held a 3-week-long convention there on Willie Gill's property. And he finally united this loose-knit group into a band of workers, a one body, a new sect. They coalesced. But there's no doubt that he was the founder and the leader. Some people like to just say he was just a worker, but he brought it all together. And he did so because John Long encouraged him to when he was wondering, what should I do? How should we proceed? The oldest of these workers that were there were in their early 30s, and the rest were in their 20s. So he set out the fundamental principles of his new belief system. There's the standards, procedures he expected them to follow. They pooled their money in a common purse. They took a vow of celibacy and poverty. Willie Gill eventually, he decided to give up his farm and be a part of them, and he was until he died, age 88, in 1951. But after that convention, major changes started. They began baptizing and rebaptizing converts. They began separating people from their churches and started meetings in the homes. And they began reaching out and pioneering to other countries and taking their gospel abroad. So they really got underway right then at that deal.
What year was that again?
That was in 1903.
Okay.
Irvine, Walker, and Weir arrived in 1903 in America. That was the first outreach. And Walker became the Eastern U.S. overseer till his death. Irvine Weir went westward, and he was later excommunicated. At conventions over there, they would ask for people not just to profess, but to volunteer to go to foreign lands. They would stand up, workers, and that's how they got their volunteers. And they mostly went, except for the few that might have gone to France or, the real close-by countries, they went to English-speaking countries, which made sense, which would be South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and U.S., those 5. And often they went where they had relatives that would support them. They knew they would have somebody. You can imagine just going to a foreign country and not knowing anybody and not having hardly any money. And they took their bicycles with them on the ships because that's how they got around back then. And sometimes the ship records would show hymn books being shipped with them too. They experienced a lot of hardship, hunger, and health challenges. Like Sam Jones, the prolific hymn writer, more hymns than any author in the book. He nearly died. He was rescued and cared for by gypsies, chapter 39. It was not easy, really. They slept out in fields. They slept on newspapers. They were rained on. One got a spider bite and died from staying in a barn. They would find an apple core by the side of the road, and that was their supper. It was hard times, often, before they got a base of believers and followers, One worker said, it would have been nice if God had made workers like turtles where their homes were on their backs. And another one said, when they were sleeping under the stars with empty bellies, I think they take us for angels. They give us credit for having wings, but no stomachs.
So that was after they kind of formalized some sort of hierarchy or Okay.
A group.
A group, yeah.
The newspapers call them a new sect.
Why were they called go preachers?
Because it says go preach. There's a verse that says go preach, and they took it from that. They also called themselves the tramps because they dressed, they only had one set of clothing, and They had brown T-shirts, which would look dirty underneath a white shirt, and they wouldn't wear collars, which in those days they were attachable. And you could wear your shirt and just take off your collar and wash it, or in your cuffs and stuff. And so they looked trampy, and they were called tramps. And they referred to themselves as tramps, and the newspaper called them tramps too.
What other titles did they take at that time? So you had mentioned, I guess this is a little bit later on, but you had mentioned they went by 2x2s in the 20s, right? 1923 or something?
Publications mentioned them as that, as early as that. Like, I have a copy of every book, that I know of, that mentions them. These books mention them, and there are some back to 1925 that have a mention in them. These are all the books that are written specifically about 2x2s. And then these are peripheral. They have to do with people that were in it, or, where they lived and different things like that. And these are books that are fiction with backgrounds of 2x2ism, or maybe somebody's biography, and they'll have a chapter that tells about them being raised in it and so forth. So I have, all of those, and that's like the earliest reference.
Okay.
And I don't know which one it's in right now.
So when William had that first convention, did they put out a workers list then, or when was the first workers list put out?
The first list that we found today is 1905. And there were two.
Years later. A couple years later after that first convention.
Yeah, it was in July 1905, and there were 200 workers on it. And some people will say, well, so-and-so's not on it, and they went, but you got to go, it was July. People entered after that. Like Elizabeth Jameson's not on there. She entered after 1905, that kind of thing. And, yeah, that's the first official one. And there weren't any just updates. And that's the UK workers, too. There were workers already converted and preaching in America because they came over in 03. There were more, but they were sticking just to their people. They call it the old country, from the old country, OC, abbreviation. And that list showed what year they went into work.
Oh, interesting.
It was lined up by years. And the first 4 workers at the top were George Walker, John Long, a couple others. We'll look at the list later.
I was always under the impression that some people didn't want to go in the work. They just wanted to be... They agreed with their teachings, but they didn't want to go in the work. Is that true? Is that how the Friends started? Or tell us a little bit about the early days for the Friends.
Well, the early days, everybody was allowed to go to their own church for the first few. So they would profess in his missions, and there were those that were elderly and all kinds that were unable to go in the work, and they helped fund. And so it was okay. Sometimes they'll say they didn't have much fellowship, like that's what they say about Dora Holland, who professed in 02. But they went to their own churches. They didn't separate yet. So there was always that body of people. And then as soon as they began putting meetings in the homes in 02, well, the Weirs accepted in 03 or 04, they had the first major convention. And there were a lot of people came to that, and they weren't in the work. So it's not true that everyone went in the work, or it's not feasible. How are you going to go when you got a little baby,
Yeah.
There were married couples that went into, on the first list, there's 4 married couples.
Do you know when they stopped allowing that?
Pretty much. I've kept a list, and there's been 50 married couples total around the world. And it was in the 1950s when Chester Sweetland wanted to marry, what's her name? Clara Denherter. And they said, no, you can't do that. And I think they married and they assumed they could stay in, and they wouldn't let them. Whereas just recently they had let another couple do that. So they made a ruling somewhere. They also made a ruling that there couldn't be any overseers that were married after the ones that there already were, Bill Carroll and some others, McClung's, that were overseers. And Jack Carroll wanted to marry Linda Hayes. And they said, you can marry, but you can't be an overseer. You could be a married worker couple. And his cousin, the Christies, Dave and Emily Christie, had gotten married in 23, and they blessed that.
So when they were married, did they go together then?
Most of the time. There's sometimes if they hadn't preached before, they would split them up and put them with separate part of another married couple even. Or, mix them with same sex. But
interesting.
It depended on the country and whoever was in charge. Yeah, the first convention was in 1904. This is major convention. Well, actually, the next 07 was the huge one, but this one was 300. And they came and went, and it was for a month. So, and it was held in a village called Ballinamallard. We visited there, and it's 4 miles from Enniskillen. So residents of Enniskillen were shocked when all these people converged on them there. And it was held on the property of John and Sarah West. And they had 250 acres and a large home, and it was called Kropp-Ehrig. I have pictures that we'll show. And we visited there. The owners were Mr. and Ms. Lone, and we sat in their parlor, and they showed us around the property, and we took pictures. Baptisms were held in a nearby river, and at that time, there were about 150 workers worldwide in 04. That newspaper, the Impartial Reporter, they sent reporters there to report, and they were very good stenographers. I mean, they have word-for-word sermons, and they really, every year that they had the convention, which would be a month or so, they would write, I think it was published like once a week or twice, maybe twice, but they reported on it. So you get a lot of information from them about what it was like. The 1907 one was the first large scale. And that was over 4 weeks, and there were 2,000 people, wow, according to the newspaper.
So was that similar to what we would know at conventions like?
Well, not so much in that they would have a bakery and an auto repair shop, bicycle repair shop, and all this other kind of peripheral stuff that we don't need. They had a post office, just more like a business because of the length of time some people would stay there. Mm-hmm. They made butter, they had a butter, that kind of deal, dairy area. And the convention was from July to early August, early July to early August every year until 1920, and they sold the property. And they moved it to a nearby home of Mr. West's brother, William. That's in chapter 21. So until 1905, they believed that all other Christians were their brothers and sisters in Christ. But that changed radically. In 1905 to 07, Irvine bought into this popular theory at the time called the Living Witness Doctrine. And it was taken from a book, from this book, which says, Natural Law in the Spiritual World by Henry Drummond. It was published in 1884. And in a nutshell, the theory was that what occurs in natural life also occurs in spiritual life. Every living thing has an ancestry, and in nature, animals and plants reproduce in like kind. So therefore, spiritual life can only come from spiritual life. In other words, from an existing spiritual person, from a living witness. Hence the title, The Living Witness Doctrine, the LWD, you'll see that. So Irvine incorporated this into his belief system. And from then on, they preached that salvation could only be transferred person to person through a living spiritual witness, which meant hearing, believing, and professing through Irvine or one of his workers. That made their church exclusively God's only right way. They believed that they were alone following the true tenets, being the 2x2 ministry and the church in the home, and that made them the only right way on earth. So, therefore, gave them a monopoly on salvation, and they became the mediators between man and God. And these two beliefs were incorporated at that time in 07. That's 10 years after they started. And it's based on a comparison or an analogy. You comparing items not in the same class, like this is natural and spiritual, is apples to oranges. You cannot infer from a comparison like that facts and truth. I mean, it's an illustration. And it wasn't part of their original belief system. Unlike what they say, it's been the same yesterday, today, and forever. It changed drastically then. But the transition was problematic. And the slogan they used for that is life begets life. Spiritual life begets spiritual life. Okay, and so how did Irvine get saved? Where did he get his spiritual life? Well, everyone knows it was from Reverend John McNeil. It's in the newspapers. He admits it all frequently. All his buddies knew it, that's where he got his revelation. And they overcame that by saying that he got a special anointing, he got a revelation, he was raised up to restore the ministry and so forth. And some viewed him as a prophet. Chapter 19 goes into this in depth. Also, there's in the comment section a link to an article says, "Does God have only one right way?" It discusses this. Irvine's chief workers mutinied around the world. The senior workers were no longer idealistic, young, naive men who just submitted to older people. They were 30, approaching 40, some of them. And William Irvine was a strong man. He was a coal mine manager, and he was used to not having any resistance and people just going along with whatever he said. He retained that spirit and attitude toward the workers. He cut them down in public, sometimes right in meetings and conventions. He rarely praised them. He had his favorites. Discontent, resentment built up. He started preaching some bizarre theology, too, that concerned them. And so he was starting to say that the age of grace had ended, and we're now in the days of wrath, and we don't need workers anymore. It's over. Go home, you know. I mean, and of course, the workers, that's their way of life, and they didn't agree. And so he had this high opinion of himself, and that was embarrassing to them. And they just weren't willing any longer to give him their unquestioning obedience. A showdown was inevitable. The reasons given for their rebellion, you can't really say. I mean, there's like 5. He lost his anointing. Cooney said that. He got off track. He preached false doctrine. He lost his mind. The most common is he was a womanizer, and he was overly proud. Probably a combination of most of those. And they didn't excommunicate him. They demoted him. What they did was refuse to submit to him anymore, and they forced him to abdicate. By this, they wouldn't let him talk at any of their conventions. He went around the world from 1903 on, 12 trips every year, going to convention hopping to all of his chief leaders. And he got to one, they wouldn't let him talk. They kept him in the house while they had convention. And that happened that year. Every convention he tried to go to, they wouldn't let him. So they forced him to abdicate, but and some people call this his soft excommunication. So they offered him a position, though, as a brother worker among them. Well, you know how well they took that.
So really quick, did they not see him as a brother worker prior to that?
He was overseer brother worker, the Uber worker, over all in all. Yeah. And he spoke at all those conventions, you know. But he was furious. He was offended. He was hurt. He claimed they'd robbed him of what he had put together and started. It wasn't for 10 more years or until 1924 that they did the hard excommunication. He had been writing letters and making havoc among the friends and, you know, all that. And finally they thought, we've had enough. But meanwhile, he went to Jerusalem. He got it in his head that he was going to be one of the 2 witnesses that were left when Jesus came back, and John was going to be one, and he was going to be the other one. So he hightailed it to Jerusalem to be on hand for when Jesus came back, and he stayed there for good. He never came back. During the war years, though, after they first wouldn't let him speak in 1914 to 18, he traveled around the U.S., he bought a car. He says he tried out every kind of religious service he could find to see if there was anything to him, and he didn't find anything anywhere. The workers just took charge in their fields. They were already over the field or the country or whatever, and so they just took charge and carried on. if they had major decisions, like, needed worldwide, like the divorce and remarriage was a decision, and there were some other things on what to do with Cooney. They had a big meeting too. And so those decisions were made with a group of about 12 overseers would come together. And sometimes they signed documents about conditions for this or that and the other. And that's how it's continued today. After the war, and he went over there, he never worked, and he had loyal supporters too. And he wrote letters back to them, and that's where this thousands of letters comes that I have. And the followers supported him. The letters say, thank you for this or that or the other. They send him coats and hats and whatever. And he acknowledges them. And he lived over there until he died in 1947 of throat cancer. And his followers would collect these letters, and they would, he had a system going where one person would type them on carbon copies, and then out of those 10 copies, they had people they sent them to, and then they would copy them. And so they had these notebooks full of his letters, his followers do. And I have several of those collections, and I have a picture of how many of his letters that I have. It's amazing.
So did those people then leave the 2x2s?
A lot of them did, and others were converts.
Okay.
Yeah. Some of them, a few of them were workers. And of course, he tried to get all his workers. He would write them letters and try to tell him his new doctrine and stuff. He had a whole new doctrine. He wound up calling the first part that he started the Alpha Gospel. That was all the workers and stuff up to 1914. And then his new stuff, where he was the witness and we're in days of wrath and all this other kind of stuff. That was the Omega message. And they called them the message people. I call them Irvinites, but they don't have a name either.
So at that point, it really kind of showed his true colors.
When he was no longer the head of Alpha, he made himself a new position where he was the head and had followers. I think he believed it, but it was really way out.
Well, Joseph Smith believes it too.
Mm-hmm.
So once they got William Irvine out, how did that change the logistics, and how did the workers proceed?
Well, a lot of people didn't even know there was an overseer found, or the other countries. They didn't tell them that when they got there. Possibly the workers knew when he came who he was. But so there was an announcement to the friends that he had been axed or deposed or anything. It would have been a word of mouth, just behind the scenes. The workers attempted to erase Irvine from their history. That was their solution, because that was uncomfortable. Okay, so what is this church you're telling us about? Yeah, well, who started it and when and why and where is he now? This is not good. You get here, well, we threw him out. He was the Lord's anointed and you threw him out? That doesn't work. So they created a memory hole, and his name became anathema. They wouldn't use it. And there were certain early stories where people would write about when the workers came to them. They changed it. They took his name out and they would say one of the other workers, or the Scotchman. That was one of them. So, they rewrote history in part, and they burned some, got rid of some, his letters, everything. And they cropped him out of pictures when they could. There would be group pictures, and you can find pictures with him and without him, the same picture, The overseers in the other countries just continued like they were, and without a supervisor. But in 1954, the memory hole was exposed. So that went on from 1914 to 1954. And a pamphlet titled Spiritual Fraud was, Spiritual Fraud Exposed was the title, by Doug Parker, who wrote The Secret Sect, but this was his precursor of it. And he exposed the origins, and he mailed it out. It was in a pamphlet form, kind of like a small newspaper, and he had a printing company. And so he was easy to come up with that kind of thing. And they did a mass mailing, And he had some helpers of other people who'd left church too. And but once that was sent out, there wasn't a way to get another copy. It wasn't distributed, it wasn't published, and so it kind of died. But that was like the first exit. And there was a lot of people left then. And then, it wasn't only the memory hole, but they substituted the falsehood that it started when Jesus sent out the disciples on the shores of Galilee. Did you know the shores of Galilee are in Ireland?
So that's probably where that originated then, to hide William?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Exactly. And even now, he was just a worker, if they admit it at all. And they'll say he was one of a group, or he might have been the leader, but they will not admit he was the founder. Rarely, I shouldn't say they will not, rarely is he admitted to be the founder. They claim to be of apostolic succession. That's what they really did, like the Roman Catholics do. But more now, they're claiming to be a restoration church, restored New Testament, the primitive church, and so forth. And but the internet was their undoing. Their whitewashing and deception and misrepresentation and suppression and concealment failed. Worse, it backfired on them. They realized they underestimated the power of history. Big time.
What happened to Ed Cooney?
Well, after Irvine was no longer the leader in 1914, Cooney implored the workers, let's go back like we were before the living witness doctrine. He did not like that. He accepted it, but he always regretted it. He just was a thorn in his flesh. And he wanted to go back to when the workers were led by the Holy Spirit. They just went and preached wherever they wanted. They didn't have territories. He didn't like being restricted to a field. He didn't like the movable wooden halls. He didn't think that was faith lines. He didn't think conventions were scriptural. And he just wanted to go back to simplicity. So they didn't agree. So he just did his own thing. He didn't fit in, and he was a wild card pretty much. And so after working with him, sending him to be with some other workers in Australia and New Zealand, trying to get him, mentored, didn't work. They excommunicated him. They had a big meeting, 1928, and they put him out, and it really, really hurt him because people he had brought into the fold, cut him off, shunned him, took away his fellowship with them. So he went on to be an independent evangelist till he died, and he had followers that supported him. By 1928, John Long, William Irvine, and Edward Cooney had all been expelled, the original 3 men. But there were 3 groups that came out of the original group, that all with the same founder. William Irvine founded them. The Two by Twos, the Irvinites, the Cooneites.
The camera overheated, but while it was off, you had mentioned there was still Irvinites and there's still Cooneites out there.
That's right. They're dwindling seriously. I was in touch with an Irvinite last year about the death of one of them, tracking that down. So some still going.
They're known as the church with no name. Why do they not take a name?
Because Jesus said, there's no other name under the sun whereby ye need be saved, something like that. And so he didn't call it a name. They don't want to add to it.
Okay, so they claim no name because Jesus didn't take a name.
That's right.
Okay. But they're, as we discussed before, they're known as the Two by Twos. Growing up in it, it was known as the Truth or the Way or the Fellowship meetings, the Friends and Workers. But they were also called Christian conventions at some point.
That's right.
Can you explain that a little bit?
It actually happened before 1941, but that's when it became widely known when George Walker registered with the Selective Service during World War II. Using that letterhead, he wrote the government and explained how they started, and he says it was a bunch of men came together, was how it started, in UK and America. he was attempting to get clergy exemption for the brother workers. It wasn't to get CO status. It was for the brother workers could be exempted. And so he wrote a history on there on that stationery. And that became publicized. Someone got a copy of that under the Freedom of Information Act, and her name was Olga Hawkins, and it went viral once it was found out. And it really disturbed a lot of people because it meant a lot to them that they didn't take a name, and here was a name.
And I suppose some of just the simple history on that too, that they weren't aware of, right? If George Walker explained in that letter.
Mm-hmm. And I have found earlier, I think even it's back to 1920 where Jack Carroll had a letter on it, I've discovered, but it just wasn't widely known. And they still don't, make it known.
So when you were writing your book, was there anything that surprised you in your research?
Yes. Let me wind up by saying that Irvine died in 1947 of throat cancer in Jerusalem. You can find him and find a grave in Mount Zion Cemetery, the Protestant section. His grave inscription says, "Awaiting the second coming." And then Cooney died in 1960 in Australia. He was 93 years old, 32 years after his excommunication. Yeah, there were some things that surprised me. When we went to the UK in 2014, we went to a place called PRONI. It's Public Records of Northern Ireland, and that's the acronym for PRONI. And before that, a lady had told me this story, and that's why we went there, that her mother was looking up their genealogy records, and she went to this PRONI place, and she had them pull up stuff, and they gave her the wrong box. And the box was all about 2x2s. And had I heard of this, and it was really interesting, and there was something about white slave trafficking in it, and blah, blah, blah. Well, of course, I wanted this. And I'd had a couple of people that had gone and tried to find it, but we didn't have much to go on. So another man was visiting Belfast, his relatives, and he's bored, and he writes to me, he says, "Is there anything I can do for you?" Well, I'm here. So I sent him looking for that, and he found it. 3 boxes like this big, huge. And I said, "Well, can you summarize it?" So he does, and he says, "You got to come see it. I mean, there's just too much. You just have to come." So that kind of prompted our going over there. So we're there, and sure enough, from 1906 to 1914, there were 6 lawsuits, 2 of them instigated by Cooney, and others were by the Friends that had the conventions, the West brothers, because a farmer who had like 6 kids and 4 of them disappeared. They went to convention and volunteered to go overseas, and where are my kids? And he's sure that they're white slave trafficking because the Mormons were doing that, and they were all uptight about it. And he got on a roll. He went from town to town. He put out propaganda. He posted things. He was a wealthy pig farmer. And, he just made huge stink. And they had to fight it to retain, they had businesses, and they weren't being boycotted. And convention ground owners in England and in Ireland. And they slandered Cooney in the newspaper, and he fought against, so they cleared their testimonies by it. There are lawsuits in the background, and it was just shocking. And, there was nothing to it. But you can see how parents would be distraught.
For sure.
And the children wouldn't let them know where they were because they thought they'd come get them. There was one lady, though, that she was underage, and she volunteered to go to America. And we have the letter from her dad wrote Cooney and said, "You do this and I'll blah, blah, blah," But as soon as she got of age, she went to South Africa to be in the work. Worse than America, But so there was that. And then, let me show you, there was an assassination by a 2x2 of the Prime Minister of Africa. This man killed apartheid. Yeah. His name is Demetrius Tassafindis. And he was a parliamentary messenger, and he professed through John Michelotus in Greece, and he went down to South Africa, and he was so against apartheid. And this prime minister was fixing to add a much harsher regime on them than ever. And while he was not a South American, he was from one of those countries, but he just was so against it that he took a knife and stabbed him when he got up to deliver this message that he was going to do that. And he was immediately apprehended. He spent the next 30 years in prison. And when he went down there to live, he rented a duplex from some Tubatus. And he knew they were Tubatus because he'd been baptized in Greece. And so Sheila Martin was the sister, and she lived there too. So her sister had these 3 rooms. And they would sit out on the porch and talk, and she knew him. And they went to meeting together. And one time at convention for his testimony, he gave the Lord's Prayer. That's how integrated he was into the system. But he actually had met some workers earlier in America and stuff, and he'd gotten some basis there. But he's infamous, but he's also revered for what that's put a stop to a lot of ugliness over there. He claimed a tapeworm possessed him, but that didn't go over.
Tapeworm?
Yeah, that was what made him do that. He wanted to end the madness of apartheid, so he murdered the creator. And then finding John Long's son in the journals, that was amazing and surprising. And it was one thing led to another, one person to another and stuff. Ultimately, John Long's granddaughter was in Faith Mission going to school there to be a pilgrim missionary. And they have a class where they learn about cults, and one of the handouts is the Tubatus. And she saw that, and it had John Long's name on it. She said, "That's my grandfather." And so the teacher told the administrator, and when the next person that went to visit Faith Mission, it was a Tubatu, he told him this story. So we were able to track down where the journals from that comment.
That's cool. Mm-hmm. Why did you write the book, Preserving the Truth?
My motive was pretty much threefold. I wanted the history, the true history, to be common knowledge. That is underlying everything. And I want it easily accessible. I had to struggle so hard to find so many of these documents and, trips and just whatnot. And so that's it, that it's common knowledge and easily accessible. And I want to carry out the vow I made to God. He came from my words, and I haven't been released yet. And I think that was providential. Then do to others what you would have them do to you. Matthew 7:12. And I wish that this had been done for me, that I had known the history. We had a right to know. It was our right. It should never have been withheld. And so I'm giving that back to people, paying it forward.
And why is it important to know the history?
There's a lot of reasons the history is important. And chapter 49 in my book has 5 bullet points about it. One is how to apply lessons learned for an improved future. If the Tubatu history and founder had not been covered up, omitted, or denied, if false, erroneous information had not been substituted in its place, and if attempts to rewrite the history had never been circulated, there would have been no need for me to write this book if they'd been upfront about it.
Mm-hmm. You haven't been to meetings for a long time, decades.
1990, June.
Okay. So almost 35 years. So what advice would you have for somebody who still goes to meetings and maybe is just learning about the history?
Well, not just about the history, but I encourage everybody to take logic or study it. Learn critical thinking, rational, irrational. Last chapter in my book covers a lot about that and how beneficial it is. I'd also encourage people to write your life story. It's therapeutic to write it down. Also, your children, There's a chapter in the book Reflections back here, my life story. I mean, my children have read it and they understand a lot of what was going on that they didn't then at the time. And I've posted a lot of these on my website, Expressions by 2x2s. And writing is therapeutic. I've read a book recently that really emphasizes this. There's a lot of tests. It helps you to let go of a lot of stuff that is holding back your immune system and other things. I would say reassure yourself that you're saved. Make sure of your salvation. And jettison exclusivity. Stop believing the living witness doctrine. It's not true. And ask for the Holy Spirit to anoint you as you do this, because He's going to help you not be deceived, and He's going to give you confidence, and He'll guide you into all truth, as He promised. I trust that, and I want everybody else to trust it too. And study and understand grace versus works. There's links to comments that I've made and writings in the comments below that address that. Question and make sure of all your beliefs. Know why you believe and what you believe, and then you will have peace and joy. And do your own independent research. Don't take the word of others. Reaffirm it. Make it your own. Learn and know about the history. Read my book. Remember, condemnation without investigation is ignorance. Remember, too, that God didn't let you down. Men did. Keep faith. Don't lose hope. Reiterating my purpose in writing the book, truth is very important to me. Extremely. You see that behind you? Mm-hmm. By writing and publishing the history, I'm doing what I wish had been done for me, that I'd been told the full story. And I believe everyone ever associated with this church has the right to know the truth about its history and have access to the documents. What readers do, listeners do, it's up to them. My book does not attempt to persuade you to do one way or the other. It's a documentary. It's the facts. Let the reader decide. And I love the verse, and you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to look at the information in the comments. And thanks, David, for inviting me.
Yeah, I appreciate your time to go into the history and a little less known for the current members, the history. And so that's been really great.
This is Cooney's autobiography by Patricia Roberts. And this is Miss Roberts and me when she invited us for tea in her home in Ballina-Mallard, Northern Ireland. She also wrote hymns and letters by Cooney, and Fred Woods was his chief right-hand man, and some other letters. These are both different ages of Cooney. This is Kropp-Ehrig, 2 different times. This is probably 10, 15 years earlier. This is where they had the first convention up until 1920. They were large-scale ones where 2,000 people came and they stayed for 4 weeks. You can tell up here, that's me, that all this ivy is grown over, although it's probably over here. And that's just the big house. It goes on a long ways out here, big courtyard and so forth. The letters of William Irvine that I have in my collection, when I put them all together, were on this very same table. And these are all collections. These are full. I've read them all at least 3 times in order to pick up details for my website and book. Here's the Christian Convention stationery. This is Jack Carroll. He's written my uncle, Herman Bieber, who was one of the prisoners in the Philippines in World War II. This was the first workers list, 1905, at July 1905. There's many, many forms of this, handwritten ones, retyped, all sorts. And you'll notice it's got Irvine and John Kelly up here with no date. John Kelly didn't leave exactly when Irvine did, but within a year.
Interesting.
And it was their first hymn book. And it's just a pamphlet to fold it over. And that's what they called themselves then. It's Go Preacher's Hymn Book. 130 hymns. The first published hymn book came out in 1913 that R.L. Allen published. And from then on, they published them. And it was music only, words only. I do have an original. This is a copy, and you can tell with all the stripes on it that somebody gave me. But just this year, a man said he was cleaning out his father's stuff, and he had one. Would I be interested?
Wow.
Yeah. So I got my own copy. Yes. That is my motto. It's the verse I read.